Conversation with the Candidate continues.
Thank you for clicking on our extended digital conversation with the candidate being Senator Bernie Sanders, the reigning champion of the New Hampshire primary here, joining us and our New Hampshire voters. And we're going to jump right into their questions with Brenda Bouchard.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Sanders. My husband passed recently from younger onset Alzheimer's disease after living with it for 12 and a half years. My mother has Alzheimer's and my sister was diagnosed last summer. By 2050, it's anticipated that 14 million Americans will have Alzheimer's or a related dementia at a projected cost of $1.1 trillion in today's dollars. So what will you do to deal with this national public health crisis that is impacting all of us?
Well, I'm sorry for your loss. And the question that you're asking, I think, is a question that millions of families are asking. We have a crisis in healthcare in general, and we have a particular crisis in Alzheimer's. People are living longer, and more people are suffering from Alzheimer's. So I think for a start, what we have to do is understand that covering all illness is something that has to be done by the United States government. That's why I believe in a Medicare for all system. And that would cover, obviously, Alzheimer's. The second thing we have to do, and I know the Alzheimer's organizations are hard at work on this, and that is we need a lot more research into the causation of Alzheimer's. I think some research has proven to be fruitful, but we need a lot more. So number one, we cover all people. We cover nursing home care. And second of all, we do a lot more research into understanding why this is such a prevalent problem.
Thank you.
Quick follow though, Senator. How does research and development work in a single-payer system? Some people would argue that the incentives are there for American innovation this time around.
I would argue just the opposite. What are the incentives right now in terms of the drug companies? It's to make money. And I think what we have got to do is tell the drug companies that, among other things, Alzheimer's is a major issue. And we want research to be done on that. If you check out where many of the drug companies are investing right now, it's often Me Too drugs that are just a little bit different than the current drugs because they can make money on that. But I think Alzheimer's is one clear example. Obviously, cancer, diabetes, these are all terribly serious health problems. And we need to invest in the research and development to help us come up with answers to these terrible illnesses.
Social media question coming in from Bill Valancourt. Climate change is a major threat to the U.S. How do you plan on working around fossil fuel lobbyists who will do everything in their power to stop anything like the Green New Deal?
That's a great question. And it's not just, you're not going to work around the fossil fuel industry. You work through the fossil fuel industry. In other words, this is where we are as a nation. The insurance companies don't want Medicare for all because they're making a whole lot of money. Wall Street wants to charge you 25% interest rates on your credit cards because they're making a whole lot of money. Now, the fossil fuel industry is a case unto themselves. This is an industry that lies every single day. The scientific community no longer debates whether fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. That debate is over. And what the scientists tell us is that we have all of 12 years to transform the global energy system if we're going to prevent irreparable damage to this planet. I got 4 kids, 3 of whom live in New Hampshire, and I have 7 grandchildren. Okay? And I believe we have got to do everything that we can to make sure that this planet is healthy and habitable for future generations. So, what do we have to do? Essentially, we need policies, which I have introduced and been part of, which says that we have got to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. We know what we have to do. We know that we can grow significantly wind power, solar power, hydro, and other forms of sustainable energy. But this is no longer a debate. This is an existential threat to the planet. And by the way, when we transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, we're going to create millions and millions of jobs. I know in Vermont, I worked very hard with success to bring energy efficiency money into older homes where people saw their fuel bills go down by 50%. We reduced carbon emissions and we created jobs in the process. That's what we should be doing all over this country. So let me be very clear. I believe that climate change is real. I believe it is man-made. I believe it is a horrific threat to the entire planet. And as President of the United States, I would be honored to not only transform the energy system in this country, but help lead the world to bring countries together to say, maybe we shouldn't spend $1.5 trillion every year on weapons of destruction to kill each other, but maybe we should work together to save the planet for future generations.
Next question comes from Elizabeth Radisich.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here. Since the advent of the war on terror, our police forces have become increasingly militarized. Do you support the arming of local police with military-grade weapons? If not, how would you propose our local police engage their
Good.
communities?
Good, very good. And I speak, as some of you know, I was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont for 8 years. And I was, if I must say so, a pretty good mayor. And one of the things that we did is try to engage the police in terms of what is called community policing, in the sense of making people see the police as part of the community, where they knew who the police officer was, where the police officer was talking to the community, talking to the kids, rather than as exists now in some communities as an invading army with large-scale military weaponry. So I think we need, by the way, reforms of police department to integrate them socially into the communities. But we also need, more broadly speaking, fundamental reform of a broken criminal justice system. All right, let me extrapolate from your question and tell you that we have more people in jail today than any other country on earth, almost 2 million people. And in my view, rather than spending $80 billion a year locking up fellow Americans, I think we should be investing in our young people. If you get them jobs, if you make sure that they have the education, there is much less likelihood that they will become involved in crime. We don't need to build more jails and incarceration. We need to invest in education and jobs for our kids. And that's something that I would also be working very hard on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, a quick follow there. The federal prison population is a target of a lot of policy reform efforts. Some people want to get 50% of those individuals out of prison, but not all of that 50% represent the drug crimes that so many people talk about. So do you agree with the 50% goal?
No,
and do you think that there are people, and what kinds of inmates should be released beyond the drug population?
Look, our criminal justice system is fundamentally broken. We have people who should not be in jail, who should be released. We have a very high rate of recidivism, which means that when people leave jail, they don't have the education, they don't have the jobs, they don't have the housing, and they fall back into the environment that got them into jail in the first place. We now have 400,000 people in jail. You know why they're in jail? Today. Because they're poor and they cannot afford cash bail. We have a war on drugs, which has been a disaster in this country, and I'm got to tell you, I support and have supported the legalization of marijuana or the decriminalization of marijuana. But to answer your question, I think it's a case-by-case basis. But I think right now we can do a lot better in significant reducing the prison population in this country. But I don't know that there's a magical number at this point. Obviously, you don't want dangerous people to be out. But I think there are a lot of people who could be released who are not dangerous.
Next question comes from Ethan Carbasi.
Thank you for being here, Senator. The current administration seems to take an active approach against science and science-based thought. What are your ideas to get the nation to start looking at policy with a science-focused lens?
So should I give you the radical answer that here it is, I believe in science. Okay. You know, I don't want to spend my whole life talking about Trump. But among other things, the idea that time after time, I think most notably with regard to climate change, he is rejecting what the scientific community is telling us, as well as many other areas dealing with the environment and other areas. I just don't know how you run a government or a business or anything else when you're not listening to the people who know what the subject is about, when you're not absorbing the data that you have to be looking at. And sadly, we have a president who is not doing that. So obviously, I will give you, the answer that you would expect from any candidate for president of the United States, that you bring the most knowledgeable people on every issue together, whether it's climate change, whether it's the economy, whether it's anything else, whether it's healthcare. We bring the most knowledgeable people together. We go out, we get the ideas of the American people, and we develop policies from that. We don't develop policies just because they make the heads of some large corporation a little bit richer.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Keith Radisich.
Keith.
Senator Sanders, thank you for being here tonight. I've been on the for-profit side of healthcare for about 30 years now. And the question that I have is stemming more from, in a single-payer environment, how do you ensure that the most qualified candidates still want to pursue a career in medicine if entrepreneurship is taken away?
Well, it's a fair question, Keith, but let me give you the other side of that coin. And you may know this, and all of you may know this. We got a lot of doctors out there, especially primary care physicians, who are becoming very demoralized, very burned out, because they went to medical school because they wanted to help people, make people well. And yet, every time they try to do a therapy or prescribe a drug, you got the insurance companies telling them what they can or cannot do. And you have a lot of demoralization among doctors and burnout. So I think what you want, the best that you can do, I think in healthcare, is first of all, get the necessary number of doctors that we need. We don't have enough right now. And second of all, get them into the areas where we need them the most. There are rural counties in this country, all over this country, where we have no doctors, all right? And we can do that. But I think giving doctors the education they need, by the way, and not saddling them with huge debts. You're aware that people leave medical school, $400,000 in debt, dental school, the same business. So what we want is young, motivated doctors, well-trained, whose heart is not to make a whole lot of money. I mean, they deserve good money, but to basically provide the quality health care that the American people deserve.
Thank you, sir.
Quick follow there, Senator. What happens in the transition to Medicare for all to people who work in the private insurance industry?
We put into our legislation a very substantial sum of money for retraining. But, you know, to be honest with you, right now, the crisis is, I've just mentioned, that in many parts of this country, in rural America especially, we don't have enough doctors and we don't have enough nurses and we don't have enough nurse practitioners. What we want is to bring people into healthcare who will not just be sending out bills and badgering you every other day about the fact that you owe a hospital bill. We want people, to as great a degree as possible, who will actually be working and improving the lives of people who are ill. So right now we are wasting about $500 billion a year on administration, all right, not providing health care. And that's one of the reasons why Medicare for All is a much more cost-effective approach. But to answer your question, will there be a transition? It's the same issue. The answer is yes. It's the same issue as climate change. Am I an enemy of coal miners? Not at all. Not at all. And we have to make sure that when people see their jobs disappear, that we protect those people with investments in their community, with extended unemployment benefits, extended health care benefits. But at the end of the day, we want to invest in health care, not in bureaucracy, not in administration, not in people pushing paper.
Next question comes from Dan Bergeron.
Senator Sanders, I'm going to read an excerpt from a publicly traded company's quarterly report, or 10Q. I'll reveal who that company is and then follow that with a question. So here we go. For the 9 months ended March 31st in 2019, revenues increased from a $759.4 million from $678.9 million the prior year. It's quite a jump. Operating income increased to $42 million from $15 million the prior year. As compared to, so this publicly traded company's name is K12.com, I might add. And public funds account for some of the revenue for that for-profit education company. Now, the for-profit industry, the for-profit education industry has definitely done very well under the Secretary DeVos, the Secretary of Education. And as a member of Manchester's school board, please describe a Sanders administration, public education funding, and how that would affect our local policies.
Well, you can find it.
Thank you for hanging in there.
Thank you for that question. It's an important question. Right now, we have for-profit, as you indicated, charter schools, where Wall Street folks and others are making a whole lot of money. We just introduced a program a couple of weeks ago which eliminates for-profit charter schools in this country. I think we should be investing heavily in public education. I think where communities want to do experimental work with locally controlled charter schools, that's fine under public funding. But I don't think that public education, that taxpayers' money should be going to make CEOs in private corporations much richer. And let me just also say that in terms of public education, we got a whole lot of problems in this country. And one of the things which breaks my heart, because I went to a public school in New York City, we have got to redefine what education means in this country. And we have got to say that there is almost nothing more important than our kids getting a quality education, which means that we have got to attract the best and the brightest young people to get into teaching, because there are very few professions out there that are more important than educating the next generation. But you know that all over this country you're seeing young people say, teaching, don't be ridiculous. Why do I want to work as a teacher, take money out of my own pocket to buy school supplies, and then have to drive an Uber car to make the income that I need for my family? So we have to raise salaries for teachers, attract the best to become into the teaching profession, among many other changes that we need. But bottom line is, we are falling behind many, many other countries in terms of the kind of scores that our kids are getting in math, science, reading, etc. This is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We can and must do better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Lauren Selig.
Hello, Senator. Thank you. I want to go back to an issue you briefly touched upon earlier, which has to do with the judiciary. As you're aware, the current Senate Majority Leader has blocked the appointment of judges for many years, and then recently has been pushing forward extremist judges at all levels. I'd like to know what you'll do to protect the judiciary.
Well, for a start, you're right. When Obama, as you know, nominated a justice, a moderate guy, Merrick Garland, in an ugly way, I think, what Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, did is block a vote on that. And that was really not acceptable. And now, as you indicate quite correctly, when I go back to Washington, you know what I'm doing most of the time? I'm just voting for extreme right-wing judges, against right-wing judges, but he's bringing them up. And that's what the Republicans are trying to do. So what I will tell you, that as President of the United States, for a start, I will be appointing judges who respect and understand the Constitution, who understand that judges have got to take into consideration the needs of working people and the environment and not just corporate profits. And also, given the attacks that we have seen in the last few months on a woman's right to control her own body, I've been asked whether that's a litmus, this Roe v. Wade is a litmus. Yes, it is. Given this moment in history, I will not appoint I will not nominate anybody to the Supreme Court who is not 100% in support of protecting Roe v. Wade.
Thank you.
Quick follow on that, Senator. Is there anything you could do as president to protect abortion? We know that it's obviously often a state issue and Congress could act.
There is absolutely a lot that can be done. I think we need national, right now it's a state-by-state decision, but I think national legislation to support what Roe v. Wade says. And that is that a woman has the constitutional right to control her own body. This really is an outrage. And I think we need federal legislation to do just that. I think we need judges who will support that. And we need states to go forward, as Vermont, I think, is in the process of doing, to make sure that that right remains absolutely firm.
Next question comes from George Matthews.
Thanks for being here. I believe the current occupant of the White House has decimated our international standing as an ally. Please tell me how you would approach foreign policy and the security of our great nation.
Well, thank you. I agree with your basic premise there. It is, again, when you talk about Trump, we always use the word unbelievable until the next day comes and it's more unbelievable. But who would be thinking that you would have a president who palsy up with Kim Jong-un, who is a terrible, terrible, terrible dictator? Do we want a war with North Korea? Of course not. We want to work with them? Yes. but you don't praise Kim Jong-un. You don't have as your bosom buddy Vladimir Putin. You don't bring the leader of Hungary, who is an anti-Semite and an authoritarian, into the White House and talk about what a nice guy he is. And then at the same time, you attack Canada and Germany and the United Kingdom, our long-term allies. So I think what we have got to do is we need a president who believes, which Trump does not, in democracy, in human rights, who is reaching around the world to bring countries together, who does not support the brutal dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, by the way, which treats women as third-class citizens. So you need a president who tells the world that democracy is the future, not authoritarianism, that condemns countries who are attacking human rights, who strengthens the bond that we have had with our long-term allies, that works with our adversaries, tries to bring peace to this world, but does not praise dictators and anti-democratic tyrants.
Thank you.
Quick follow on that foreign policy, Senator Sanders. Obviously, the commander-in-chief has the most powerful weapons at his or her disposal, nuclear weapons. Do you feel you would be capable of using nuclear weapons in defense of the country?
Oh yeah, anytime. I mean, was I capable of blowing up the world?
It's a great moral question.
No, it's not a great, it's a great immoral question. I mean, the answer is not whether I'd be capable of blowing up the entire world. What kind of question is that? I would hope no president is ever in that position. The real question should be is how the hell we get rid of these nuclear weapons that are threatening the entire planet. And I would be aggressive in doing that. Right now, we have a president who wants to spend more and more on the military and more money on nuclear weapons. I want to see us not abrogate treaties with Iran or any place else which have controlled the growth of nuclear weapons. I want to see us be aggressive in bringing the world together again to figure out how we can substantially not only reduce military spending worldwide, but how we can reduce the ongoing and long-term threat of nuclear weapons. So let me just say, while we're on that subject, I've been criticized recently by some of the mainstream media for my views on foreign policy. But as I've said recently, I'm not going to apologize for that, and the people of New Hampshire will have to judge. I was a leader in the effort to stop the war in Iraq. I did not believe Dick Cheney, and I did not believe John Bolton, and I did not believe President Bush that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And if you go to the YouTube, you'll see the speeches that I gave. So I'm not going to apologize for that. More recently, as you know, I led the effort in the United States Senate to pass a resolution to get the U.S. out of the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen. People know what's going on in Yemen? It is the worst humanitarian disaster on earth. UN tells us 200,000 people will be dead by the end of this year, women and children. And if we don't get a handle on that war and stop that war, we're talking about millions of people dying of a famine. This is being led by the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia. I think America should be part of that. I don't. And right now, you got a president who appears, although he changes his views every day, but John Bolton, at least, his national security advisor, wants a war with Iran. Now, how crazy is that? Have we not learned anything from what the war in Iraq was about and all of the destabilization and loss of life we experienced there? So I'm going to do everything I can to stop that war in Iran. So I don't apologize for trying to do everything humanly possible to stop wars and destruction and to try to reach diplomatic solutions. Now, I know it's good politics for politicians probably who have been in this room to say, hey, I'm going to be tough on this one, and I'm going to be tough on that one. We're going to blow them off. Fine. But their kids are not the kids who are going off to war and who are dying. All right? Not their kids. So yes, I'm not a pacifist. Sometimes war is, unfortunately, what has to be done. But you are looking at somebody who will do everything that he can to make sure that our kids are not dying in the Middle East. I was the former chairman of the Veterans Committee. I talked to too many families who lost loved ones in wars that we should not have been fighting in.
To the original question, though, if Kim Jong-un launches a nuclear missile at the United States, you are not responding in kind.
No, I didn't say that. Let's do everything.
Just to clarify.
Look, let's do everything that we can to prevent that. And by the way, I have criticized, no one has been more critical of Donald Trump than I have been on so many issues, including many we've discussed this evening. But I have not been critical of him for sitting down with Kim Jong-un. You do sit down with your adversaries, even when they're terrible dictators. So I've not been critical of them, and I will do that as well. We need to figure out some resolution. But let's not talk about whether or not I have the courage to blow up the entire world. We got to do a little bit better than that. We got to prevent that day from coming.
Next question comes from Richard Bruno.
Hello, Senator. Thank you for taking my question. My question is concerning the dark money in politics that influences many of the decisions that are made in our government.
got it.
How would you handle getting some of that dark money out of
Look, you often hear me talking about the massive level of income and wealth inequality that we have in America. We got 3 families that own more wealth than the bottom half of America, and 50% of all new income goes to the top 1%. But that's just not an economic issue. It translates, as Richard says, into politics. What do you think the Koch brothers and other billionaires do with their money? What they do is say, hey, you know, we're worth $50 or $60 billion. That's not enough. We don't want to pay any taxes at all. And you got a situation now where, listen to this, Amazon, owned by the wealthiest guy in the country, Jeff Bezos, made $11 billion in profits last year. How much do they pay in taxes? Anybody here know? Zero. Pay less in taxes than you do. Now, how does that happen? It happens because these people have enormous power. They elect candidates who fight to give tax breaks to the billionaires and then to cut programs for working people, whether it's education or health care or whatever. So, to answer your question, what do we have to do? For a start, we have got to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which allows billionaires to buy elections. It is a corrupt system. That's all. You get one vote and you get one vote. The Koch brothers should not be able to spend $400 million to elect candidates who will give tax breaks to billionaires, who will continue the path on climate change, not addressing climate change that we're in right now. So that's number one. You've got to overturn Citizens United. The second thing that we have to do is to end voter suppression. We have to make it easier for people to participate in the political process, not harder. Then the third thing we have to do is move to public funding of elections. You want to run for office and you're not wealthy, you should be able to run for public office and not be dependent on big money contributions. And I'm very proud that I think my campaign in 2016 and right now has revolutionized the way politics takes place in America. It used to be the politics was sitting down in the living room with some wealthy person collecting a whole lot of money and then hiring a consultant, putting ads on TV. Well, we ran last time, we raised an average contribution of $27. I didn't sit in wealthy people's living rooms. I was out talking to the American people. And you know what? A lot of candidates now understand that that is the right way to go. So I think we're making some progress, but obviously we have a long path in front of us.
Thank you.
A couple minutes left here. We'll let you wrap up on a question we've asked of a few of these candidates who've come our way. Can you tell us about an instance in which you faced adversity in your life that made you a better leader?
Yeah, I'll tell you about one. I grew up in a family that didn't have any money. How's that for adversity? All right? And that's something I've never forgotten. Yeah, I'm not like Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump's parents gave him $200,000 a year in allowance when he was a kid. Well, my family gave me 25 cents a week. And I saw struggle within my own family. My mother and father, wonderful people. They did their best. But we lived in a rent-controlled apartment, and every time there was a purchase of any significance, a pair of drapes, a new table, there was fighting in the house. My mother's dream in life was to get out of that rent-controlled apartment and finally own her own home. She died young. She never achieved that dream. So knowing what it is like to live paycheck to paycheck, knowing what it is like to worry you're not whether you're going to pay for the light bill or put gas in the car, that's something that I do know. I know that in my guts. That's not an intellectual thing. That is something which I know and I feel. And that's what's going on all over this country. I know what it's like for families to live under the stress and fear. My God, what happens if dad gets sick and has to go to the hospital? Are we going to go bankrupt because we can't afford to pay that $100,000 bill? Or what happens when we're saving up to send our kid to college, but the car broke down and we're not going to be able to do that? We need a new car. So here's the story. Bottom line, then this is what motivates me, is that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, half of our people should not be living paycheck to paycheck. In New Hampshire and in Vermont, thousands of people should not have to work 2 or 3 jobs while 3 families own more wealth than the bottom half of America. Now, I know that this is not talked about on television very much, and there are reasons for that, okay? But at the end of the day, we can and must do what other countries are often doing. Healthcare is a human right. Making sure that kids can go to college without going deeply into debt is not a radical idea. Listening to the scientists and addressing the crisis of climate change and creating millions of jobs is not something that we should be debating. It's what we should be doing. Equal pay for equal work for women is not also an extreme idea. So I am, what my life has been about is growing up in a working class family. I have not forgotten where I have come from, and as President of the United States, that background, my life experience, is something that will shape my policies.
Senator Sanders, thank you for joining us for Conversation with a Candidate. We
Thank you.
appreciate your time. Thank you to our studio audience of New Hampshire voters and your questions. Thanks to you for watching. Be sure to join us next week for Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado. But again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Senator Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.